I mean, if Coach was a good coach, she probably would just run.
Even when it's raining.
Right.
Are you excited about the exam? Looking forward to it, right? Yeah, that's what I thought. Sure. What I did was, since we're not going to cover all the chapters in class, I put up lecture capture from one of my other classes. So we're still going to cover chapters 14, 17, 18, 19, 20, and 21. You guys have kind of done inquisitive and all that for that. But I'll make sure that the questions on those chapters are easy. Okay? Kind of like, what's your name? Oh, okay, that's true. I can't remember my name either. Okay, so anyway, I sent out an announcement, and on the announcement I put in the different lecture captures that you can all watch. We're going to do one of them today, the chapter 19. So we've covered what a population is in evolution, but now we're going to look at actually at how populations change over time. So this is still ecology, it's population biology or population ecology. If a population is growing, well, first you have to be able to say what the population size is. So you can measure that, and then you can see what happens over time to it. It can go up, it can go down, it can go extinct. It cannot change. It can be fairly stable. So one of the things that makes population changes, of course, are birth and immigration and death and emigration. So let's say we have population 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And obviously birth, we could add 1. Or let's say we have another population over here. One of these can come over here. That's immigration. Similarly, this population right here, one of these can go back over there. That's emigration. Or, of course, we can die. Right? So those are the things that basically change populations. Now, in one of the things that well, let's think. What do organisms need? what do you think that's limiting in terms of what organisms actually need? Energy, food, right? So, other things is perhaps lack of space, where they can build nests or whatever. And then there's some other things that can actually limit populations, like disease, predators, loss of habitat. So, in terms of food shortages, these are all, well, the first two are limiting resources, okay? So, if resources are limited, one of the things that's going to be going on is what's called competition. Now, in terms of competition, there's going to be competition, let's say, for food. And when you reach that level, let's say we've got let's say we have this much food. Once a population, if it starts growing, it reaches that, it can't go any higher. Okay? There's only so much food. If it does go higher, then it's going to be pushed back down to what that is. And this is actually called carrying capacity. So population ecology is a study. Population density is the number of individuals per unit area, whatever that is. You can define it yourself. Usually it's a square kilometer, square mile, or it could be square meter. Population doubling time is the amount of time it takes for a population to actually double if there is enough resources, right? So before populations can grow, there has to be an increase in resources, or they're going to overshoot and they're going to crash. Okay. Okay. So when a population has more than enough food, so on the bottom here is time. And on the y-axis is number individuals. Okay, so if, let's say you have a very small population and it grows like that, that is called exponential growth.
it takes a population to double its size is a good sign of how fast a population is growing. In this example, a single-celled organism, a paramecium, divides in two, as do each of its offspring, one generation after another. Notice that a graph of the population's growth, in which the population continues to double over a particular time period, appears J-shaped. It is called a J-shaped curve, and it describes exponential growth, which is population growth under conditions in which a population grows freely with no constraints. If the doubling time happened to be shorter, the exponentially growing population would grow larger even faster. Most populations do not show exponential growth for long. They run up against limiting resources, such as habitat, food, or water. Rapidly reproducing single-celled organisms are useful models for population growth. With a laboratory growth medium as its environment, a population of paramecia grows exponentially at first, showing a J-shaped curve. But as limited resources have to be shared among more individuals, the growth slows and levels off. The population size nears a limit called the carrying capacity as resources begin to run out. At the carrying capacity, the population growth rate is 0. The resulting S-shaped growth curve identifies a growth pattern called logistic growth, in which the population grows nearly exponentially at first, but then stabilizes at the carrying capacity. Carrying capacity is defined as the maximum population size that can be sustained in a given environment. For the population of paramecia, the carrying capacity is 200 cells per milliliter of growth medium. Because different species have unique needs, the same environment can have different carrying capacities for different resident species.
Okay.
Top hat?
Hmm. So let's see, what does an S-shaped growth curve indicate? A population that continues to grow at a slow but constant rate. A population shows a sudden spurt of growth within a constant rate. A population that grows exponentially at first, but stabilizes at the size the environment is able to support. A population grows at first and then begins to slow but continually decline. Anybody not done?
No, I have a question. So when the population is growing exponentially, when they hit the carrying capacity, have humans hit the carrying capacity? Because aren't we growing exponentially?
we might. And
Oh,
then,
I guess it hasn't officially
um,
happened.
yeah, so there's at this point, our population is going to continue to grow. But if we've overshot the resources that are able to support our population, then eventually that population is going to either have to stop growing or it's going to crash. What's this? Okay. Okay. Guys, good. I'm proud of you. Okay. So, exponential growth, and at a certain point it's growing the fastest that it possibly can grow. Obviously, there are populations, let's say like bacteria, that can, as long as they have enough food, they can grow like crazy. But because their generation time is, let's say, 10 minutes or 20 minutes, whatever it is. With a lot of animals, the generation time is, let's say they can produce offspring once a year. So it's obviously going to be a lot longer period of time. So in terms of logistic growth, of course, so here's the carrying capacity. So you see that's some limiting resource, whether it's food, water, place to live, whatever it is. And so we have population growth that starts out like exponential, okay? If there was no limiting resource, then it would keep growing. But in this case, it comes up to the line. Let's say it overshoots a little bit, and then it's stabilized. In other words, when it reaches, as it's approaching carrying capacity, the population growth rate actually slows down until the growth rate is 0. Okay? If the growth rate is negative, let's say, do this, so like that, that means the population is declining. There are more deaths or immigration away from the population than the individuals that can actually be supported. Okay? So as long as the population is growing, that means the population, the growth rate is positive. If it's stable, at a certain point, the population growth rate is 0, and if it's declining, it's negative. Okay, so this is just an example looking at mosquitoes. Mosquitoes have a fairly short generation time, probably a day or two, a couple of days before the female can actually lay eggs. Females, by the way, mosquitoes do more than just drink blood. They also pollinate a lot of plants. Okay, so the only individuals that actually drink blood are females that need the blood for producing eggs. The males produce or eat only nectar, and the females also eat nectar. So obviously, the red line is exponential growth. If there was no limit on the number of individuals, in other words, the number of individual females that could produce eggs, it would keep growing. And then, obviously, there's only so many individuals that the mosquito can bite and get blood from. Well, they can keep drinking blood over and over again. Okay. Okay. This carrying capacity. This carrying capacity can change. It is not fixed in time. Okay? First of all, let's take a look. So, okay, here's time, and let's say we start out, this is the carrying capacity. So, population grows up to that, but let's say that's the first 2 or 3 months of the year. And then at the 6-month point, there's more food, let's say it's summertime, and the carrying capacity can go up to there. Okay? Later in the season, it's the end of the growing year, and let's say the actual carrying capacity actually drops all the way down here, okay, for the rest of the year. So, in other words, this capacity can then shoot up. Actually, let me, so we got this, shoot up, and then it's going to drop down to there and stay at that. Okay? So, also, of course, instead of looking at seasonal, we could just say these are years now, and the same thing can happen. Certain years, like last year, we had a lot of rain. We had a lot of plant growth. We probably have a larger population of a wildlife that was able to live off of that plant growth. And so the carrying capacity can change over time. Two. Already seen that. Okay. So here we go. Population, human population. We'll say, actually, it looks like human population, modern humans, anatomically modern humans, showed up about 300,000 years ago, but we'll say 160,000 years ago, plus 2,000. So, in the beginning, the population was small. There were other populations that they were competing against, archaic populations. So, and other animals, and there were other processes that were going on, like predation. So back then, dinosaurs could have eaten, now they can't. Sorry, there were no dinosaurs back then. But there were a lot of things that aren't around today. They were certainly saber-toothed cats that were around eating people. So population was very low. There was a guy named Malthus who wrote a treatise, a paper on human population growth. And he came up with this idea that the human population should be able, at some point it's going to outgrow the amount of food that it can actually grow to support the population. And this is what he defined as it was subsequently called the Malthusian crunch. In other words, populations are always going to reach the capacity for the environment to support it. And at some point, a population can't grow much more than that. If it does, or if it gets up to that, it's going to be pretty hard on the population because there's really not going to be enough food. Oh, and there's one thing I want. So, the human population, first of all, it was able to grow. Probably starting at 10,000 BC because of agriculture. Okay? Humans could grow more food than they could have before found by being by going out and hunting and gathering. Okay? So at a certain point, 10,000 BC, the population actually probably started to grow because they had agriculture. And then that pretty much, over time, there was enough food for the population to grow because the population, remember, is expanding out of Africa and Asia and to Australia and then North America. So there's more places where the population can live and be supported, so the population slowly grows. The thing is, at around 1800, that was the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution let people, it kind of raised the carrying capacity. It didn't mean that they were living all that well. In fact, they were working their tails off. But in general, more individuals were actually surviving childhood and making it to adulthood. So let's say up until then, the average age was probably 30 years old, but remember, actually, the structure of the population so we'll say 1 year old, 5 years old, 10, 20, and up to 50. Okay, so usually what happened was populations, individuals, families had, let's say, an average of 10 children. Okay, they started out, let's say, number of individuals, okay, 0, 5, 10. They start out up here, but within a year, most of them die. A lot of them die. If they make it to 5, that's amazing, but usually they don't. And then from then on, this is the maybe 2 out of 10 actually survive to adulthood and breed. Okay? So usually what happens is, with this kind of a situation, you breed as much as possible with the hope that some of them are going to make it to adulthood. We have a different population structure nowadays. We'll look at that in a second. And then, of course, those individuals, once they make it to here, the chances of surviving older, let's say to 40, goes up pretty high. And then there's even a few people that actually make it to 50 and 60, even 80. Okay, there aren't very many nowadays. At least half the population, well, the average population age when someone dies is about 80. Okay, that's including births and deaths and all that. So, population size in the old days, you were lucky if you ended up with 2 individuals that made it to breeding age. Okay, this limited the population size to, it may be to the point where it was replaceable, but it didn't grow very much. Okay. Nowadays, okay, we have a certain number of individuals that are born. Let's say, actually, so 0. Okay, and for the most part, we don't have very many offspring anymore. But most of these offspring actually survive. Okay? In fact, they survive all the way until they're 80 years old or longer. Okay? So we have fewer offspring, but actually more actually survive. They don't get, the young ones don't die so easily during childbirth and the first year of life. There's still a little bit of higher mortality then, but not like it used to be. Okay, so at 1800, more and more people were living. People were still having lots of children. There was a greater carrying capacity, and the population started to rise. By 1945, well, 1800, it was maybe 1 billion people. That's spread all over the planet. 1945, it's still only 2.3 billion. That's a lot bigger than it was, but not like it is today. By 2005, it was 6.4. Right now, it's about 7.6 billion people. It's still rising. We're actually getting better at producing food for the population. So we had a green revolution starting in the 60s and 70s, and that has continued. And so our population is still growing, kind of like an exponential, but there is some sign that the population is actually slowing down. Namely, first of all, medicine was better. So even populations where they were having lots and lots of offspring, more and more of them were surviving. So places like Africa, India, things like that, they're still having very large number of offspring, number of children. And because of better sanitation and things like that, the death rate is slowed down. There's still a lot of much higher infant mortality than there is here, but still not as much as there used to be. Okay, so that's one of the things that's causing the population to grow. Plus being able to grow more food. And then in developed countries, Europe, United States, East Asia, and so on, as populations gather more wealth, they tend to get better education and they tend to start having fewer and fewer and fewer children. So instead of having 10 children and 2 surviving through adulthood, in the United States now, the average is 1.6 children. In other words, below replacement level. So, and then the same thing throughout Europe, throughout China, Japan, Korea, Australia, all those countries, those individuals are having fewer and fewer children. In the United States, and also in Mexico, and a lot of other Latin American countries, the same sort of thing has happened. Once people get up to the middle class, they start to have fewer children. They put more resources into each individual child. They usually have much fewer children than if they're still peasants making a basic living, trying to live off the land. Okay? So it's looking like now the population the growth rate is declining. But the thing is, there were so many people to begin with that the population is going to continue to grow just because there's all these more people that actually are going to have kids. Even if they're only having, let's say, 2 kids per couple. Okay. Okay. So there's things that limit population. One of them is called density-dependent population change. And this is basically the carrying capacity. And what happens is, the more individuals there are fighting over resources, the more competition there is, and that stops the population from growing. So the population density, how many individuals you have in a certain area, the more population, the more competition, the more the population is going to slow. Now, there's also other things that will limit the population size. That has nothing to do, really, with density. So these are affected by factors that have nothing to do with the density of the population, usually outside. So let's say you live in an environment and there's only certain kinds of habitats, small patches, that can actually support individuals growing. Now, if there was more of these spaces, then more could grow, but there's not. So the population, the individuals, once they get into a place, that's it. They can't support anymore. each little habitat fragment. And so the population is kind of limited not by the number of individuals and the resources available, well, kind of the resources available, but it's not like there's all these individuals competing for each other for where they're living. So, for example, overcrowding affects many species. The plantain here is a small herbaceous plant that has decreased reproduction in crowded conditions. Okay? So seeds planted for square meter, and up until a certain size, the number of seeds, they can grow, and then they hit a certain point. Okay. So for example, here's 1911. These are reindeer. 25 reindeer were introduced in St. Paul Island off the coast of Alaska. So there's very few. And they started to grow in size. The population rose to more than 2,000 individuals right here, about 1940. And then they actually went above the carrying capacity and they crashed. So, in other words, the density went up so much that they were competing so fiercely, there was not enough food to allow them all to live. The population crashed. And it actually crashed so much because they basically ate themselves out of house and home. In other words, the carrying capacity might have been, whatever it is, let's say 100, and they went so far above that they destroyed the habitat so much that in the end, only a few individuals could actually survive. Okay. So this is an example of density-independent population limitation. And the same thing would happen if there were predators around. Okay? So bald eagles, DDT was used to control insect outbreaks and things like that. And it turns out it caused problems in a lot of birds. The eggshells were really thin. The offspring never even hatched. And so the population actually crashed. There was more than enough food out there. They weren't competing for food. It's just that their population never got up high enough because there was a failure to reproduce properly. And like I said, in DDT poisoning, this could just as easily have been so you have let's say at this point, you have a moose population starts to grow, and right at this point, wolves are introduced. Okay? Actually, let's do it down here. Okay? So we got a population up there. Wolves are introduced. This is carrying capacity, by the way. So there's definitely density dependence, but at this point with wolves, they start eating them. They bring the population down to here. There's now more than enough food to support the population, but they never eat themselves out of house and home because the wolves are limiting how many reindeer actually survive. So this is actually density independent population limitation. And that usually happens from some external force that limits the population, not with resources, but with something else like predation or disease. Okay. So, and then, although it seems like these populations, they go up, they go down, a lot of times populations don't follow that sort of cycle. Sometimes, especially with insects and rodents that have a great ability to produce more individuals than can possibly survive, you get a situation where you go up really high and then it's all over the place, okay? So you can have an irregular kind of population size that doesn't really seem to track what's going on in terms of carrying capacity. So Brazil mounted a massive anti-mosquito campaign in the 1950s. They used insecticide. They actually pretty much eradicated Aedes aegypti, which is responsible for a bunch of different diseases, but they stopped. And then in the 1970s, the mosquitoes came back breeding like crazy, and so we had a kind of an unregular fluctuation. And then we can also have the situation where you have a population that cycles periodically. And a lot of times this happens, we could actually write out an equation, when you have prey and a predator. So what you actually have, let's say this is the prey right here. Food. And then we have the predator. Okay, and it's cycling just a little bit. As the prey grows, it takes a little while, it starts to grow too. When the predator gets so high that the prey starts to decline, the number of prey, and then the predator also declines because there isn't enough food. So a really good example of this is lynx and snowshoe hare. And lynx are obviously the predators, the hare are the prey. Here's the number of lynx, and then here's the actual number of hare. And you see that there's a correspondence. These guys start to grow a little bit early compared to all of them, and then the predator follows in suit. And once the predator gets very high, it's eating more and more of the prey crashes. They get down to a certain point, the predator drops as well, and then the whole cycle starts again. So in this population, the actual food for the prey has nothing to do with the population size. Okay? They never get to the point, there were no lynx there. The prey would grow much, much higher. Let's say up to here, right? And the only thing that would limit it would be food supply, probably at certain times that the population would crash. But that's from competition, not from predation. Okay, that's good enough. Okay, so I'll put out a study guide today. There's going to be 50 questions on the material we've covered or not quite covered, and then 25 for the rest of the semester. It's going to be pretty simple. And then there's going to be extra credit, 15 extra credit of which we will count. Okay?
So what's the answers to these?
What?
The answers to this?
Let's see. What's the result of a rapid increase in the population density? A lack of food to support the sudden increase, an increase in behaviors not adapted, an increase in death due to increase in disease, all of the above.
All of the above.
Probably. Yes. Okay.
Is there because
Just to make sure the test isn't this Wednesday.
What?
Is the test the final this Wednesday or the next week?
It's next week.
Next week, okay.
Yeah.
no, baby.
Professor Salud.